The relevancy of Diluc and Genshin Impact has been a wild ride. He was once considered a top-tier pyro DPS during Genshin's early release. Then, as time went on, he became a victim of power creep, leading him to be nothing more than just a standard 5-star that people get mad at for losing their 50/50s to. However, in 2024, he gained a resurgence in popularity, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Let's take a look back at the journey of Diluc in Genshin Impact. During Genshin's early release, Diluc was an undisputed meta character who towered over most of the DPS options at the time. His dominance can be credited to a combination of reasons that aligned really well with the game's early design and mechanics. First of all, he was pyro. Pyro has always been one of the more favoured elements in the Genshin community, mainly thanks to Vaporize and Melt, since both those elemental reactions have fairly nice damage multipliers. Unlike now where you can play as a DPS with pretty much any elements thanks to certain characters being released or buffing certain elements, Pyro has always been pretty consistent with how powerful it is. And with Diluc being a Pyro character, he can easily trigger reactions like Vaporize and Melt, and his kit at the time made him ideal for exploiting these powerful elemental reactions, since Vaporize and Melt were the most sought after reactions for high DPS output at the time. Another reason why Diluc was liked at the time was because his kit is fairly easy to use and was pretty effective. Diluc's elemental skill allows for 3 consecutive pyro-infused attacks, each with short cooldowns before the ultimate cooldown begins. These attacks could be seemingly woven into normal attack combos, allowing for nice pyro DPS damage. As well as this, his skill was also ideal for triggering pyro reactions, since it didn't require complicated means to do so, which made him accessible even to the less experienced players of this genre. His elemental burst provides massive AoE pyro damage, and this wide area not only allowed Diluc to take out multiple enemies at once, but even after his burst was over, enemies would still be affected by pyro, ensuring that Diluc or other characters could continue triggering elemental reactions even after using it. And finally, at this time in Genshin Impact, there was simply a lack of competition because of the limited character pool. At launch, Genshin didn't have many other 5-star DPSs who could rival Diluc in terms of raw damage outputs. And even if other 5-stars could match or come close to his damage, they would require more intricate setups than Diluc, which made them less accessible. With fewer competitors for the main DPS slots, Diluc naturally became the go-to option for most players who were looking to maximize their damage at the time. The combination of his easy-to-use kit, high damage potential, and synergy with early supports like Xingqiu and Bennett made Diluc an obvious choice for the DPS role at the time. However, as time went on and more characters were released, Diluc was becoming a victim of power creep. Here's how it happens. As we said before, Diluc was initially well used for his pyro damage and his ease of use, but as more characters were being introduced, his selling points were becoming overshadowed. Hu Tao, who released in early 2021, became the most notable pyro character to officially surpass Diluc, and was the top pyro DPS character for a long time. Hu Tao's elemental burst and her skill not only offered much higher damage potential, but also synergized with the game's HP-based scaling mechanics, allowing her to deal massive damage, and her Vaporize and Melt reaction damage also massively outclassed Diluc. Yoimiya, who is another pyro character, specialised in single target damage, and she also chipped away at Diluc's place in the meta. Yoimiya is widely regarded to be not as good as Hu Tao, but her burst and rapid fire attacks allow her to be a solid choice in certain scenarios, especially in boss fights where single target damage was key. Aside from more characters being released, elemental reaction power creep also comes into the picture. As we said before, in the early days of Genshin, pyro reactions like Vaporize and Melt were the most reliable way to deal massive damage, and it really worked for Diluc at the time. And pyro was one of the damage dealing kings up until version 3.0, which introduced Dendro. Dendro introduced reactions like Bloom, Quicken, and Hyperbloom, which further expanded the elemental reaction pool, as well as elements you could use to be DPSs. These new reactions offered more ways of dealing higher damage, which reduced the relevance and over-reliance of pyro-focused compositions. Vaporize and Melt were still good, they're still great, don't get me wrong, but these new shiny ways to play took the spotlight away from Vaporize and Melt. And finally, Diluc was just too simple in a game that was evolving. Diluc's straightforward playstyle was one of his biggest strengths, but it became a liability as the game introduced characters with more dynamic and complex kits, making them more exciting to use and more relevant to the game's states. In the end, Diluc was a victim of his own early success. Of course, there were, and still are, players who enjoy his playstyle, but Diluc's fall from the meta during this time was a clear example of how power creep reshapes a game's roster over time, with newer players pushing boundaries of what's possible while leaving older characters like Diluc behind. Not saying that no one used Diluc. Diluc was still popular within the niche that liked him, and I think that's what's so good about Genshin. Because it's a single player game, even if units are quote-unquote meta, I think Genshin's done a very good job at not completely pushing old characters like Diluc away. They're still usable, but you know, he was no Hu Tao. Diluc became just someone you lost your 50-50 to for a while and didn't think too much of it. That was up until this year, in 2024, where he got a resurgence in popularity, which was largely thanks to the introduction of Xianyun and the rise of plunging playstyles that she enabled. You see, Xianyun brought a breath of fresh air to Diluc's viability by introducing a new buff for plunge attacks, where any character in the game can jump high enough to inflict significant plunge damage. Although plunge attacks had been used sparingly in the past, it was locked behind characters like Xiao, where you could only use plunges consistently with those characters. But the release of Xianyun and her kits made plunges a viable strategy for high-level content for all characters, allowing characters like Diluc to capitalize on it and gain relevance again. You see, Diluc has always had high plunging scales, but it wasn't easy to use before Cloud Retainer came along, so people didn't pay too much attention to it. Before 2024, people who wanted to use this part of his kit had to master a technique called dragon spiking. Dragon spiking was a difficult to implement combat style that focused on dealing massive damage through plunge attacks, using a skilled and difficult combination of sprinting up to an enemy, jumping and plunging. It wasn't easy to do, but during the early stages of Genshin, people figured out that tall Claymore users were the easiest to do it with. However, it was never really widely used in places like Spiral Abyss because it was simply too inconsistent to use in a time-trialed environment like that. However, come to 2024, and this technique has become more refined and consistent thanks to Xianyun. Just use her burst and bam, anyone can plunge, which gives a new layer of strategy and ease to what was a previously very niche mechanic. So the previously overlooked portion of Diluc's kit, his high plunging scalings, suddenly and finally became relevant in the game's landscape, and just like that, Diluc's plunging attacks quickly became a crucial part of his overall damage output. So when you lose your 50-50 to him, and when Xianyun finally gets a rerun, you have a use for him now. Diluc's resurgence in 2024 is a perfect example of how Genshin Impact's evolution can breathe new life into old characters, even after years of being pushed and pushed further into quote-unquote obscurity.